Welcome to the Singularity Lab, your home for futurism, breaking technology, scientific exploration, and UAP discoveries. Join the conversation with expert guests on a unique journey that explores the limits of human innovation, evolution, and imagination.
And we are live. Welcome, everyone, to the Singularity Lab, the show where we explore the intersection of society, culture, and human evolution through the latest advancements in science and technology. Thank you so much for joining us today as we help you navigate this insane and rapidly evolving technological landscape. Joining me today is Brooks Lopez, my co-host. Brooks, what's
Hey, Mike. How you doing, buddy?
I am fantastic. We've got an amazing show for you all today. Joining us today is Christopher Plain. He is a novelist, a comedian, and the head science writer at the Debrief. And my God, is this man prolific. We're going to be covering some of his most recent articles on extreme brain science, including a new magic drug that purports to restore memories and unleash hidden knowledge. We're also going to be discussing an article that he wrote about fighter pilots and how brain changes in fighter pilots may be aiding future space exploration. We're going to discuss how the Australian Army is developing a new form of enhanced digital telepathy that allows soldiers to control robot dogs using brain signals, as well as the potential neurological and psychological benefits of psychedelics. Brooks, this is going to be a good one.
I think it's going to be fantastic. I can't wait to get started.
Ladies and gentlemen, the one, the only, Christopher Plain.
Michael, Brooks, good to see you.
Hey, Chris, how you doing, buddy?
Good to see you, man.
It's good to be seen. I just want to tell people, if you never get a chance to be a guest on the Singularity Lab, and it's a long, 3-year application process with a waiting list and everything, is when you actually get backstage, just to loosen you up before you come on, Michael sings the entire Italian national anthem in Italian. And It's the 27-minute version, the World War II version. So it really just set me at ease. So I appreciate you taking the time to do that, Michael.
Yeah, no, I really
he won't do it anywhere else either.
Yeah, no, I won't. And I really appreciate
he won't, man.
I really appreciate. Well, I appreciate you bringing that up because we do have some really interesting stuff that goes on behind the scenes. So you guys make sure you're here early every week. Maybe we'll share some of that behind the scenes with you. Chris, man, what's so you guys? Okay, so let's just start with the Debrief, right? So you are the lead science writer over there. You've got we're going to cover some of the amazing articles that you've been writing lately. Talk to me a little bit about kind of the evolution just of the Debrief in general. You guys have a podcast, multiple podcasts now. You guys are killing it over there. How are you staying so up to date with all of this?
Things have really ramped up in the last, I would say, years. So, Mike, the Debrief started back in November of 2020, kind of hot on the heels of all this big UFO news. And there was a couple of big UFO articles at the Debrief, and it kind of launched everything all at one time. But the true backbone of the Debrief, the well over 95% of the articles we put out, and the vast majority of researchers we talking to, are mainstream scientists, but often with an edge. I like to call it kind of the mad science beat. So I talk to regularly college professors, university provosts, research scientists, people like that. But it's often people who are working on something, I know the term cutting edge is a little out of date, but something that's really kind of on the threshold of lots of these things just don't pan out, but a lot of them do. And so these guys these men and women of science, they go down the most unique, interesting paths. And at the Debrief, we follow them down those paths and we report on them. And things have just really, it's just really grabbed hold. We found our core audience over there by about the end of the first year. The second year really started ramping things up. And it's really become very popular. And the thing that makes me feel good is it's become popular with scientists. So when I reach out to researchers about an article we're writing or something along, maybe a podcast, Chrissy wants to interview them or whatever, a good percentage, like I would say the majority now, tell me, oh yeah, I've heard of the Debrief, or I've read an article in the Debrief. And so We're gaining that reputation that only comes over time and good reporting. And you know, we had some missteps, I would say, in the first 6 months of the thing, where we had one or two things we were, you know, and for me, I was learning how to do that type of writing. As you mentioned, I have a few novels under my belt and a couple more coming. So I came from a different type of writing, and writing the news and writing about these really insane, like, scientists are working on something where even like as a nerd, you go, what? They're working on what? So yeah, it's really been fun, and really got our feet under us over there.
That's amazing. And I love the fact at the debrief that you guys don't shy away from, you know, controversial topics and things that are extremely, you know, at the forefront of science, because we never really know what's going to develop down the line. But if some of these things aren't getting coverage early on, then, you know, it's very difficult to follow the entire process. And so I really respect and appreciate you guys for doing that. So let's dive right in. I want to talk about this this magic drug. If we could get our AI Randy to pull up the article called "Magic Drug Restores Lost Memories and Unleashes Hidden Knowledge." Can you tell us a little bit about, maybe give us a quick summary of this story and what some of the findings were?
Yeah, so the researchers behind this, I believe this was a research team in the Netherlands, and the researchers behind this, what they found was, or at least their theory was, that when you make memories, they're there. You may not always be able to retrieve them, but your brain makes the memories. So the example they used was pulling an all-nighter, studying for a big final at school. You go, you sit down, and you just blank. And you go, man, I studied all night, and I'm blanking on these answers. And then 6 hours later, 12 hours later, the next day you go, and it comes back to you. And you go, that was the answer. It was there all along. I literally just couldn't access it.
Right.
So the idea was, how do we access these memories, these lost memories that are in our brain that have been stored, and not only access them once, but essentially make them repeatedly accessible, make them a permanent memory, like a typical memory. So they had a theory. And so what they did was, first they tried it kind of the old blunt force method. They used what they called optogenetic therapy. So they created
ocular genetic therapy.
Opto, like meaning light, OPTO, optogenetic therapy.
Okay.
So the what they did was they took a protein, they put it on the surface of the hippocampus, which is a spatial memory part of the brain, and they would shoot light at it, and the light activates that protein, and in theory would reactivate the memory, right? So they took some mice and they put them in a obstacle course, and they had them run the obstacle course a number of times till they pretty much memorized where the food was, where the water was, all the other aspects of this course. The next day, or in some cases days later, they would put the mice back in, but they would move something, maybe one thing, two things, and see if the mice remembered where the thing was before and went to the wrong room, or if they ultimately figured out the new location. What they did then is half of these mice, they sleep deprive them during that first phase. So when you're sending them through and they're essentially remembering where everything is, they made them sleep deprived. Then when they went back through the obstacle course, as they expected and hoped, the sleep-deprived mice didn't notice that something had been moved. They didn't remember the previous setup. They just kind of wandered around until they found the food or found the water, where the mice that hadn't been sleep-deprived went right to where the food was or right to where the water was. And then if it wasn't there, they were like, what the hell? And they would start looking for it. So then they took those mice that couldn't remember, they cracked open their skull, put this bioactive protein on that part of the brain, the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is the part of the brain that, among other things, specializes in that like spatial type memory, like physically where things are and how to get to the store and, you know, things like that you take for granted. That's in the hippocampus. So they put this protein there. They shot it with light to activate it. And sure enough, the sleep-deprived mice were suddenly able to remember where the objects were and go right to them, the preferred objects. So in a sense, in effect, they determined the memory was there. It had been stored the first time. But for some reason, some biochemical reason that they still don't completely understand, they couldn't access it. But when that brain region was activated with chemicals and the light activated the protein, all of a sudden they could remember where it was. So they said, all right, in the real world, we don't want to go around cracking people's skulls open and shining light. You know, it's a slightly invasive way to bring back memories. So they said, is there a way to activate this same part of the brain chemically? So after doing some research, some anecdotal evidence, as well as just how the chemistry of the protein they synthesize, the optogenetic protein, worked, they zeroed in on an asthma drug. I believe the name was roflumilast, if I remember right.
That's correct, yeah.
Is that okay? So they zeroed in on this this asthma drug that created a synthetic protein.
And did they? Was this the first drug they attempted, or was this they just started throwing random chemicals at it? I mean,
no, that's why I said they kind of pre-selected. They had a feeling that this category of drugs that interacts with this part of the brain would be the right thing to try. Whether or not they tried multiple ones of that category or they just went with roflumilast, I can't tell you for sure. But that was the drug they ended up on. And in their study, they report no results of any other drug. So I can tell you the odds that they use another drug are pretty low. Usually you will report failed results or correlative results, partially successful results. And I read the whole study. So I believe, excuse me, that is the only drug they tried. But they knew or suspected that drug acted on the hippocampus and on that part of the brain the same way that the protein that they were activating with light would. So they kind of cheated and said, we think this is going to work before they did it. And it did. They gave the drug to the mice. They gave them this asthma med. And all of a sudden, they could remember things they had forgotten. And specifically the things that they had learned while sleep deprived, but just weren't able to access in a normal way. All of a sudden, once they were on this drug, they could access it.
And it seems really fascinating. So I did a little bit of reading on the roflumilast. And so first, it's actually the initial drug created in this category. So it was a kind of a one of a kind when it was first developed. It seems to be an anti-emphysematic. So anyone who has emphysema should work for COPD, asthma. It's an antibiotic. It also reduces pulmonary hypertension, so high blood pressure. And then even beyond that, it still has this this neuron enhancing ability in the hippocampus, very similar to the optogenetic light therapy that they were giving them. So it's really crazy. It seems to be a drug that has very wide array of effects, for positive effects for humankind.
Yeah, you know, in brain chemistry, I forwarded Mike a number of stories I wrote recently about brain science, and I know some of these are going to be covered today. And this is why this is so exciting, is this is really a lot of new territory, as you pointed out, Brooks. Like, this is a first of its kind drug. This is a lot of new territory. We haven't really, until we had functional MRIs, magnetic resonance imaging machines, fMRIs, we couldn't really see what was happening inside the brain while we were stimulating it with light, stimulating it with electricity, or in this case, doing both, or stimulating it with a drug. And so now you can put humans or animals under this fMRI, and you can see which part of the brain is lighting up, whether you move a hand or you laugh or sneeze or smell something. All these different parts of your brain light up. So this sort of science, this ability to look into unlocking lost memories and hidden knowledge is cutting edge. This is brand new stuff, and it's only stuff that we've been able to do in the last decade or two. So there's so much science to be tried. These are kind of the first people building the first steam engine, and there's so much more learning to go past this phase.
I remember being like a young, and I guess we'll even call it naive, college student who worked in a research lab, and I was reading all these incredible studies that were using the fMRIs and getting this real-time data for what's lighting up in the brain. So I went to my head of my lab, and I was like, "Can we get a couple of these?" And they just kind of laughed at me. They're like, "Are you kidding me? This is 2010, and these are tens of thousands of dollars, maybe per use at that point in time." But it's really fascinating technology, and it's just going to continue to allow us to kind of determine what that brainscape looks like in its functionality.
Yeah, I have a question related to obviously these tests were done with mice, and you cover a lot of science. And one of the things that always I think frustrates a lot of folks with animal studies is oftentimes these things are not easily replicated in humans. Can you give us an idea as to what the confidence level is that this drug is something that can be utilized for humans in memory retention?
Sure, that's an excellent question, Mike. The two biggest issues when it comes from translating animal medications or animal studies to human studies is safety and biocompatibility. So the safety aspect is just that. Like, it might be something that you inject into a mouse and it doesn't cause them a problem, but it's highly toxic to humans, maybe affect our kidneys or liver or the brain or something else completely differently. So because this is a drug that's already exists for use in humans, roflumilast, they're confident that it's safe. So the first big barrier that whether it would be toxic or dangerous to humans is knocked down. The biocompatibility, which is the second part I think you're really getting at, is, all right, well, you give this diabetes drug to a mouse and it gets skinny, but you give it to a human, it doesn't do anything. So is the efficacy the same, or the biocompatibility? So their belief is, and this is the reason they came to this drug in the first place, as I said, was their belief is that, yes, that's their hope to go to larger animal studies and then ultimately human clinical trials to see if they can, in particular, help people with brain injuries or memory loss conditions start rebuilding and reconnecting to memories that are stored in their brain, but they're not being accessed. And I think that's a key part here. There's a movie called Limitless with Bradley Cooper, and at one point he takes this medication, and he even describes, he says, all these things, something I read on a pamphlet or 10 seconds of a commercial I heard, or all these things started coming together and becoming available to me on the tip of my tongue, where they were hidden knowledge, lost memories, disappeared in your brain, but they were still stored there. It's almost like finding an old hard drive from your computer that's got all these old files on it.
Oh man, I'd kill for this.
You can access.
Well, what's interesting is that there are people out there who have, it's not just perfect recall, but they have basically perfect memory index where they remember every detail of everything. And if I remember correctly, unlike Bradley Cooper, they don't end up becoming U.S. senators necessarily. So it still kind of determines what you do with it, but it's there, right? So the hippocampus is really important. You mentioned for spatial recognition and recall, but also as an indexing function for all of the memories that get stored in the cortex. And so if we could make a perfect transition between the two, I mean, I always like to use the analogy of the, card catalog at the library. The books don't go missing. You just lost the card maybe. And if we can keep that index in perfect shape or perfect health, I mean, I would imagine that, your deterioration in the long run, things like dementia and Alzheimer's would be greatly affected. So
the condition you're talking about where people have that perfect recall is called hyperthymesia. And sometimes people refer to it as an eidetic memory, although, again, eidetic memory is just a new branding of photographic memory. And there's a lot of argument of whether anything like that even exists, because your brain doesn't take a photograph of information and you access it. Your brain, your eyes, your ears, all that process the information and then store their processed memory. So you're never getting a perfect photograph, or even an eidetic memory is a fun thing to use in fiction. But hyperthymetic memory is actually a real thing. And I remember hearing Marilu Henner, she was an actress on the TV show Taxi, and they made a show called Unforgettable, which was just a drama, cop solve the crime sort of show based on her personal experiences. And obviously she wasn't solving crime, but she has this memory, and you could really pick out a day, a time, 30, 40 years earlier and say, what were you doing at 2:30 in the afternoon on June 2nd of 1981? And she could, as you said, like that, like her card catalog was perfectly indexed, and she could go right to it, go right to that day, and pull up every aspect of that memory. There's literally only been a handful of people on the planet that have been identified to truly, when she did the special, she was one of 6 people they knew about. This is about 15 years ago that they knew about that had this type of memory. And one common complaint amongst all of them was life was miserable. Everything in their life was constantly in the present, that you couldn't forget a bad experience, that nothing ever went away. You couldn't separate. And what they found was, a big part of what was happening was, and it was happening on an unconscious level, is in effect like mental rehearsal of these past things. So basically, if you think about a great memory you've had and you constantly revisit it in your head, that great memory stays relatively intact because you're constantly re-accessing it. Where if you're not accessing it, that connection, that access that this drug seems to be reconnecting, that access goes away. So I think the downside could be they find a therapy like this, it works, and it works too well. And all of a sudden you have people that are trapped in the present with every one of their memories. And again, like I said, something that was communicated to be a very miserable existence.
Yeah, that's such an
no
important
filter,
point.
right? Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah.
Well, no, I just wanted to say, like, how, you know, the human brain is designed to not access all of your memories at any given moment, or we'd be absolutely overwhelmed, overloaded. There'd be no way for us to focus on the thing that's actually happening right now. So that would be horrifying.
Well, and think of all the stuff I'm constantly and intentionally trying to repress.
Right? Yeah, by this time tomorrow, I will have shut out this entire interview just based on the trauma aspect of it.
That was the pre-show.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
that was the singing. Oh, that national anthem, Mike. It was so beautiful. I'm still moved from that.
Thank you so much. We'll share that in a future podcast. Jez Shaw, thank you so much for the $50 donation to the show. You are an absolute superstar. We really appreciate it. Jazz says, it seems like there's a vast difference. Jazz Shaw, by the way, is over at the Debrief as well. Is he? You guys are still over? Yeah. So he says, seems like there's a vast difference between physical brain damage and our lack of understanding how consciousness works and how we store, process data. What do you guys have thoughts on that?
So I remember actually an anecdotal case in which there was a gentleman who had like a railroad spike driven through his brain. And it happened right around the temple area and damaged both the left and right hippocampus. And he had both antero and retrograde amnesia, if I recall correctly. And so he was able to exist. He had like perfect semantic memory, like knew what things were and could identify things, feed himself, do the normal thing, but couldn't create any episodic memory. Could never remember anything from the past and learned new stuff every time over and over again. And he was put in his own special hell where both everything was exciting and new, but he couldn't retain it to save his life. But to show that all that semantic memory was there, the ability to identify, like, that's a dolphin. It's really fascinating of how little we understand that long-term potentiation, that learning, and later the memory process.
It also reminds me of dementia and Alzheimer's, how I think someone described it to me at one point, like it's not a matter of forgetting where you put your car keys, but more a matter of forgetting what the car keys are for. This idea, you know, it's a very different, it's very, I mean, just the pain and struggle of going through something like that is brutal.
Well, since Jazz brought it into a question of consciousness, I can tell you that when people who study like animal science, look at levels of consciousness. So lately there's been a lot of study of like birds and how smart they are and things they can do that we didn't think birds would be able to do. They have something called recursive thinking, which is the idea of you can tell a dog, go there, pick up the bone and bring it back. But you can't really tell the dog, go there, pick up the bone, go over there, put the bone down, grab the ball, go back, put it where the bone was. You know, it's a recursive thinking. It has a multiple layers. And that's exactly what you're saying, Mike. When it comes to brain damage or brain disease, those higher levels of thought or those more complex mechanisms of thought and memory are the things that seem to really be impacted, particularly by Alzheimer's or dementia.
Right.
So it could be along the lines of the question that Jazz is asking is, could there be a memory, and what Brooks is pointing out, memory could be this almost like functional mechanical thing, but the understanding of how to do things, the understanding of how processes work could be a higher level thinking, and that's really what's interrupted by a lot of brain disease or brain illness.
Thank you so much, NeuroStream, for the $2.99 super sticker. You guys' support for the show is incredible. I think this is a perfect opportunity for us to kind of shift into another article that you wrote. This one's called "The Mystery of How Psychedelic Drugs Rapidly Rebuild Neural Connections Solved." And so I wanted to dig into this a little bit because I think it relates to the other story as well. Can you give us kind of a I don't know, a debrief of this article?
Yeah, it was cute. You're so cute, Michael. Adorable. So the idea of how. So we were talking about functional magnetic resonance imaging, and we were talking about watching the brain while you're doing things. And what they found was in these last, decade or two of this sort of sciences, people that are experiencing extreme mental health conditions, and by extreme I mean like treatment-resistant depression. So they've tried every type of drug and therapy and it's not working, or a treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder. So they've been through a traumatic situation or situations, and no matter what therapy they take, no matter what drug they take, nothing works, right? Nothing is really helping them dramatically with this situation. And when they put those kind of people under an fMRI and they look at their brain, what they find is certain areas of the brain have almost no activity. They have almost no or very diminished activity. So in the same way, like someone like Michael J. Fox, who has an extreme condition that makes it Parkinson's, that makes it hard for him to move, that's because of dramatically reduced connectivity in the parts of the brain that go with controlling his hand motions, controlling his head motions, controlling his eye movements, and all that. With depression, with extreme depression, and with PTSD and these sort of things, they're finding more or less the same thing, that the parts of the brain that are associated with mood and attitude and energy, focus, things like that, are dramatically diminished in somebody who's got that, almost as if the brain is being affected physically, like a traumatic experience is so traumatic, or whatever is causing the depression. And we do believe now more than ever that depression is I say we because, I'm a research scientist. But what research scientists tend to believe is, in light of a lot of the new research about NSAIDs and SSRI inhibitors and all of that, like Prozac and these sort of drugs not really working or not having the effect they hope, that's been the whole issue, is there's a physical component going on and not just a neurochemical component. So the brain has reacted to these traumas and has diminished the connectivity in that area, either as a safety mechanism or as just an accident. The same way swelling happens in your knee. If you injure your knee, it might swell up to stabilize that, but that swelling might cause other health problems too. So the brain protecting itself from trauma or protecting itself from a depressive situation was causing dramatic loss of connectivity in those areas of the brain. Well, the flip side of it is, in recent years, and really, again, cutting edge, the last 10, 15 years, have been these studies on psychedelics. And the thing about science and the studying of medications, or even herbal medications, I gave you guys a story about herbal medication we might talk about later. But the thing you're really looking for is what's called efficacy, meaning it does something, right? Like everyone knows if you take LSD or if you take Molly or you take ayahuasca, that shit does something, right? What it does may not be good, may be extreme, may be trippy, but it has an effect. It has very high efficacy. And we know it has an effect particularly in the brain. So what they do is they've started to take these drugs that they know have high efficacy and then have anecdotal evidence that they help with depression. And there's legitimate like retreats you can go to now and have a weekend with the shaman if you're having really bad depression or really bad PTSD. It's not something I would recommend because the science isn't really that well hashed out. But what they were finding anecdotally is people that took psychedelics were reporting dramatic improvement in those areas. They were reporting, hey, I'm feeling better. My anxiety is lower. My depression is lower. My focus is higher. And again, focus is always a key component of all of these situations. So they were finding it seemed like their brain was working better again. And what do you know, Mike? They went and looked at it under an fMRI. And when people were on psychedelic drugs, the areas of the brain that were showing low connectivity, low electrical connectivity for depression patients, for PTSD patients, were starting to light up. They were starting to show connections.
During the psychedelic experience?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, while their brain, and oftentimes lasting for days, weeks, or even months afterward. You know, I don't want to get too far off the field here, but you know, Carrie Fisher, who was in Star Wars, used to talk about, she would do the electronic brain stimulation. When I was a kid, they used to call it electroshock therapy. And she suffered from depression for decades. And she said when she would go in, it was an exhausting day going in for this electroshock therapy. But she said, I felt right when I came out. And I felt right for weeks or months or sometimes as much as a year afterward. And I would know when it caught up with me because I was feeling a certain way and I would go back in for more electroshock to the brain. And what they suspected at the time, and now with the advent of good fMRI, what they're finding is it was doing the same thing. It's reactivating these areas of the brain that weren't working right. They just weren't connecting. Whether it was a defense mechanism, which is what a lot of people suspect, or it was just a side effect, or the illness itself, something you were just ill, and that's causing depression. You know, depression is often associated with heart disease and other medical conditions. So there was a belief that maybe it was physically caused. But yeah, so there was already this kind of signpost with electroshock therapy pointing towards that. There was all this data on MRIs pointing towards it. Then they started putting people under fMRIs while they were on LSD, ayahuasca, the frog venom from Colorado. I forget, it's a 5-O-DMT.
Yeah.
5-MeO DMT.
Yeah, that one, Brooks. So they did. They found that when they would look at the MRI, those areas were firing again. It was back to work. It was back, all hands on deck electrically, and the people had dramatic improvement. They still didn't know how, because again, we haven't even been able to really experiment with psychedelics in a clinical setting until very recently. There was such a, so connected with the counterculture and hippie movement in the 60s and things like that, that establishment, and particularly medical establishment, essentially reacted with, let's ban it all first and figure it out later. And we're just getting into that figure it out phase, not just with opiates, which we know are just now everywhere and just about the worst drug on the planet in so many situations, but these things that had no addiction component or minimal addiction component, but high efficacy. If you take a Molly, something happens and you experience that dramatically. And so they said, how are they doing this? How are they making? And that's what the article is about. That mystery was solved. So that's all the background to it. What they figured out was when you go down to the cellular level in the brain where you're reestablishing these connections, the chemical has to get there, right? It has to interact with the nerve cell to cause these new cortical growth, to cause the new dendrites to reach out, to cause the cone growth in what they call the Gogli body, which is a little area of the brain, but an area of the nerve cell. And so how was it doing it? Because a lot of stuff that seems like it should work wasn't working. The example they use is serotonin. As a matter of fact, the specific receptor is known as a serotonin 2A receptor. And this particular receptor in the brain that was connected to this diminished electrical activity, depression, suicidal thoughts, lack of focus, these issues, that they found that if you zapped it with electricity, it would work. But if you gave it a hallucinogen, but if you gave it serotonin, which was specifically designed by our own bodies to interact with, that wasn't working. And they figured out. And so they did some tests. They said, you know what, maybe what's happening is, and this is what a lot of work by research scientists is, as much trial and error as any other area. They said maybe what's happening is it's not getting to the nerve cell and causing the growth. The serotonin is not getting there. They always thought all those receptors were on the surface of the cell. And the serotonin's banging up against the surface of the cell, and there's no new growth, there's no new electricity. But when they gave it LSD, MDMA, psilocybin, these sort of drugs, those drugs are able to permeate the cell. It's able to get through that cellular membrane, get to the right inside to the nerve cell, and stimulate it directly. And Mike knows a few things about being stimulated directly. He'll talk about that later. But, so it gets right in there, and sure enough, all this activity, all this cell growth, they took cells and they put them in a petri dish, and they shot it with psilocybin and some of this other stuff. And sure enough, it's, oh, you know what? I'm confusing it with another study. I'm sorry. See, too many brain studies in one thing. So in this particular one, this was the fMRI they were doing it. So yeah, they found that when they gave the drugs that couldn't permeate the cell, even if they were designed to increase connectivity, they wouldn't work. But when they tinkered with it, or they used drugs that already did it, went right through to inside the neuron, connected right to the receptor, and voila, new growth and new connectivity.
So is this okay? So when we talk about things like SSRIs and drugs that are specifically designed for depression, you're saying those drugs are the ones that have difficulty permeating the cell.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and so now
but
that
the psychedelics are the ones that are magically getting through.
Right, and so Brooks, I'm so sorry. I think I'm getting a little feedback from your mic. I think maybe when you, I don't know if it's I don't know what that is. So the idea is that the psychedelics are able to permeate. Now, are the scientists looking at developing derivatives of these psychedelics so people can get the benefits without necessarily having the psychedelic experience? Is that where?
Why would you want to do that?
Yeah, right. So
some people don't want to take psychedelics. It can be a very, very scary. It can be a very difficult process, and some people don't want that. You know, I definitely think there are therapeutic uses psychologically as well, which you have another story about, which we'll get to in a minute. But I'm just curious if that's the idea.
I think, yeah, you know, so when you're talking about drugs that have an effect on consciousness, perception, or intoxication, you're always looking for a way to get the best of the one side and not the other. So like in the early days of using marijuana for cancer, for people that had wasting and they couldn't maintain their body weight, they couldn't eat, they couldn't maintain appetite, they would develop drugs like Marinol, which would use the extracts of the THC and the aspects that they thought would help with the appetite and those things without getting you high. You know, Melissa Etheridge, who famously took marijuana when she was undergoing cancer treatment, said, yes, because of course we want to remove the one part of the drug that makes you feel good while you're doing it, right?
Right,
so,
right.
So, but with psychedelics, yeah, you're talking about a lot more than feeling good. You're talking about, as you explained, Mike, can a very heavy, intense experience, can be a very disorienting experience if you're dealing with somebody who already has other health situations. Imagine you're extremely depressed and then you start hallucinating horrible things. That doesn't seem like it's going to go well, right? It's probably going to go the opposite direction if you were treating depression.
Right. Or if you're schizophrenic, I mean, there's a host of serious mental health issues that aren't necessarily good for people to take psychedelics if their mental state is in such a in such a difficult place. Now, but it's my understanding that if done in certain settings, in certain ways, that it can be beneficial. But yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary. If you've never had a psychedelic experience, it can truly be life-changing. And so speaking to that, you wrote another article. Let me see if
is this the mystical one?
Yeah, this was the one from Okay, so mystical experiences.
This is key to what we're talking about.
Exactly.
So I was going to transition it there.
Yeah. Mystical experiences from psychedelics offer highest psychological benefits. New study reports. Yeah, talk us through this article.
So, Brooks jokingly said, "Why would you want to take the mystical or the psychedelic part out of the psychedelic experience?" And we all kind of joked about it. But as it turns out, that may very well be the case. So what they did was, in this particular study, this was a questionnaire. They surveyed 985 people from all different walks of life, all different health situations, who admitted to having used psychedelics in recent days and weeks. And they were asked to rate a handful of things. So their insightfulness, their openness, mental openness, and that was kind of subdefined in a couple of categories. And then how challenging, or how mystical, how insightful, and how challenging the experience was. So while you're on the psychedelic, was it mystical? Did you experience, mysticism? They gave a definition for what mystical is, but did you experience that sort of magical connection with God, or connection with the universe, or connection with all other people? These sort of things that are very commonly associated with a psychedelic experience. And insightfulness, meaning, did you glean something out of that experience? Did it give you knowledge? Did you feel like you understood yourself better? You understood the world better? You were suddenly able to forgive your mother for something that you haven't taken for 30 years. And all of a sudden you have this insight into life. And then how challenging was it? Which is what we were talking about, which is how difficult was the experience? Was it super emotionally difficult? Or did you hallucinate scary creatures coming to get you? Or hallucinate that you were having a heart attack and dying? Or that you are dead, which is a common psychedelic "I'm dead" pronouncement from people on psychedelics, right? So
reminds me of those 9/11 calls with people who take too many edibles. And they go, 9/11, what's your emergency? I'm dead. I'm
dead. That's actually when I call Mike Mataloni at like 3 a.m. Orlando, or wherever you are, Florida time. I just like to say I'm dead and then hang up on it. Yeah, so what they found was, in going through this data, now granted, there was a lot, again, with psychedelics, we're dealing with a lot of anecdotal evidence. We're dealing with a lot of stories people have told about the use and things that have permeated. But this idea that you could get the connection benefits in the brain, you could get that chemical neuroelectrical benefit in your brain. So new neurons are built, new neuronal connections are made, and therefore your depression is better, or your PTSD is better, is really sound science. That's really sound science that should work that way. But what they found was, in the anecdotal sphere, and the people actually using the drugs recreationally, and people who had these symptoms, either very low depression symptoms, high anxiety and depression, and those were the things they focused on most, they found that when they rated the experience as mystical, and when they rated the experience as insightful, They also rated their depression, anxiety, and stress way lower than the people that said, yeah, I took it. It wasn't that mystical. It wasn't that insightful. I mean, you know, I took the drug and I tripped, but it wasn't that, there was nothing that magical. I just saw weird things and had a weird experience. Those people weren't getting the benefit. They weren't, by far, weren't getting the benefit. Now, there was kind of a trigger point with how challenging it was. So the people that, the best set of circumstances, as you might suspect, was it was mystical, it was insightful, but it wasn't challenging. It wasn't that challenging. That was the group they called the high response. I forget the term in the article, but high response. The low response group was the one I just described, where they had none of that. It had no mystical component. It wasn't insightful at all. It wasn't really challenging either. It just fried, and 3 hours later, I was having dinner. And then there are the people that had the positive experience, they call it, where it was insightful, it was mystical, but it was also challenging. They went through some stress and some emotion to get there. Both of those groups, as long as you scored high on the insightful and the mystical, you were getting the benefit. Those people were reporting dramatic reduction in symptoms of depression, anxiety, and for extended periods of time after the study, weeks or even months after use.
That's fascinating. Go ahead, Brooks.
I was just going to say, I think that's the most fascinating part, is we're not talking about a continued dosage. This is potentially a single or maybe a couple uses having a long-term 3 to 6 months. Some of the stuff I've read is 3 to 6 months.
Yep.
Pervasive effect.
You know what's interesting when we're talking about brain connections, Brooks? What I find interesting, the study we were talking about before, where you're retrieving lost memories or hidden knowledge using the asthma drug. It was once that corridor was reconnected in the brain. So once they could access the memory they couldn't access before, they could always access it. So it was like that pathway is created. So there is some theory within the psychedelic drugs and what we're talking about now, that maybe that conscious component, that conscious experience of going through it, of having some challenging, but having a mystical component, an insightful component, is almost a side effect of you experiencing your brain reconnecting to itself and making new connections. So you're riding that. It's like your brain's coming to life and you're conscious while it's happening, or certain areas are coming back to life. So you're going, oh, you're having insight like you hadn't had before. And there's something magical about it or mystical about it. So whether it's challenging or not, if you're going through those components, you're going to get the health benefits, or at least that's how all the initial studies are showing.
Well, that very much
at the debrief like a year ago about the mystical experiences, and it was kind of a previous story we had done on a whole separate research that was an lab environment with a much smaller group. This one I mentioned was like 985 people, much smaller group, but same results. Mystical, insightful, you get the benefits. Not mystical and not insightful, you don't get them, whether it was challenging or not.
Well, that speaks to, and I know Brooks was kind of in jest earlier when it says, why would you want to, have a psychedelic experience and not, have that part where you're actually going through that experience? And it very much speaks to that idea. There's a neurological component and then there's a psychological component, and the psychological component has a lot to do with the reduction in symptoms of depression and things like this. It's interesting. I read a while back, Michael Pollan wrote a great book about psychedelics called How to Change Your Mind. And in that book, he goes through, at Johns Hopkins University, he goes through a lot of the research that they were doing with psilocybin, and finding very similar results to what you're talking about right here. Is the people who had these mythical experiences, some people call it the death of ego. They were having these experiences, and and anecdotally, that's what triggered the reduction in that depression over a period of time. Brooks, you brought up the point that a lot of this lasts 3 to 6 months, so one would have to wonder, is this something that one needs to do recurring? So do I need to do in order to maintain the effects of the reduction in depression, anxiety, and some of the other things that are happening here, you know, do you have to re-experience again and again? And you know, there's definitely two schools of thought here. One is what are the actual neurological effects, and then what are the psychological effects that are promoted through the actual psychedelic experience. I remember in How to Change Your Mind, there was one woman who, she was an atheist going in. She was suffering from extraordinary depression. She had a psychedelic experience, said she spoke to God, came out of the psychedelic experience with extremely low levels of depression for many months after, and still maintained that she was an atheist. She said she talked to God. It brought her depression down. This was somebody who was on her deathbed. And she had this enormous anxiety about dying, and the anxiety was nearly gone completely. She said she talked to God, but then she was like, but I'm still an atheist. It's like so fascinating how you can get all of those results out of a single experience.
Yeah, it's totally true. You know, I think one of the things about the permanence and whether or not you would have to do it again every few months or every whatever, part of the key to the brain being able to regrow connections or reestablish connections, or go the other way to limit connections and reduce connections. Like I said, maybe as a self-protective mechanism. It's a term they use as neuroplasticity. And that's a term that neuroscientists use to describe that physical aspect of the ability's brain to be plastic, to adapt to situations one way or another. Because the brain maintains that neuroplasticity, even as you age, although it's not as good and it does lose some of it, my guess would be you're probably going to have to do a treatment every few months or every 6 months or whatever. It's probably not the idea of permanent changes to the brain. Sadly, only seem to be permanent negative changes, right? You could fry a part of your brain and that has been physically fried or physically damaged. And there's probably not a path for that coming back. But when you have these positive changes or an improvement of connectivity, the odds of that all on its own going away over time are probably a lot more likely. Probably a lot more likely that neuroplasticity will return to its previous state, especially if you're experiencing depression or things like that because of outside forces. If you're still poor, no matter how much drugs you take, if your poverty is making you depressed, then 3 to 6 months later, you're probably going to be depressed again.
Yeah.
You know, one of the drugs that I've seen that has a slightly different response, that has a more long-term permanence is, Chris, are you familiar with ibogaine?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
So ibogaine is most typically, my understanding is, it's not a trip that you would like to recreationally enjoy, like some of these others. Probably higher on the challenging scale, but my understanding it can have a pervasive long-term response for addiction, particularly people who smoke cigarettes, have very high physical dependencies on alcohol, even opiates, and ibogaine can have that change to the neuroplasticity where it's not something that you have to go back and do every year to change. You might go and have one long experience over, I think it can take up to a day or so to get out of your system. But once you do, you're never going to want that cigarette again, with some of the research I've seen there, which is fascinating.
Yeah, and there is some research in ketamine, and they use ketamine therapy for people who have treatment-resistant depression. And they have had some people report permanent changes, so they're not having to go back and retake the drug again or redo the therapy after a certain number of sessions. So there might be some aspects of that. It's probably not impossible that you can have a permanent fix in a situation like that. But typically, when I write about and read about neurological studies and things that involve neuroplasticity, there seems to be a tendency of the brain, like other organs, to kind of revert back to whatever the state it was in before you gave it the treatment. So
magical homeostasis, right?
Yeah, it does seem to be how the body goes. And as I said, it's often reaction to external stimulus. So if you're drinking toxic water in the neighborhood you live in, no matter what sort of treatment you get to make your body healthy again, you go back to drinking the toxic water, you're probably going to end up in the same situation. So brain science seems to be very heavily that way. Although I've read a little bit about ibogaine. I'm not that tuned into it. I understand it's a horrible experience.
That's what I've heard. Yeah, it's not something you would ever recreationally choose to do. I mean,
You
does
know,
that pique my interest? Of course, but I don't know that.
You know, interestingly, and just totally unrelated or semi-related, I had read recently, you know, there's a lot of momentum behind Ozempic, this semaglutide, this drug that people are using for weight loss. And you know what? One of the #1 side effects they're finding is people that use it consistently to lose weight are losing their desire to drink alcohol.
Interesting. Interesting.
How? Why? We don't know, because again, these sort of drugs are brand new. This sort of like, you know, obesity, particular morbid obesity, was always treated as a character failure or something wrong with the person. And then when you give them this drug, all of a sudden they just don't eat as much. They're not quite as hungry. It is a very normal chemical change, the same way a diabetic getting insulin can now process sugars or whatever they're finding. But yeah, one of the common side effects of this is people are saying, I have no desire to drink anymore. So I said, my joke was, that's just because you're not fat anymore. You're not depressed. So, like, hey, I got thin and then not in the mood to drink.
Don't need to drown my sorrows any longer.
Yeah,
I guess.
Right. Exactly.
But
did
you
we
know,
lose your Banky? Yeah, he looks like he's having trouble.
he is.
I think I lost
You know
my
what?
mic.
We can
going.
hear you now. We can hear you now, Mike. One of the things that you had mentioned with that, Chris, was that you like, do we understand the mechanism behind it? And it's so fascinating when we see these drugs that are used initially for a particular case, asthma and the. Ooh, I lost my camera there. There we go. Asthma and the roflumilast is a perfect example. You know, we have a drug that has one good use case, and suddenly we see 2 or 3 others that are completely different. And what the difference between the physical reaction and the lungs and the pulmonary system is, and then suddenly we have this incredible neuroenhancer. Continuing down those pathways with some of the other drugs that exist to see what potential other outcomes are out there blows my mind.
And it's a path that pharmaceutical companies love taking, because that drug has already gone through the hard part of getting.
Yeah, there's no development dollars, right?
Right. Yeah. So if you stumble across Viagra, which was sildenafil citrate, was like a blood pressure medication, and you stumble across this amazing side benefit, all of a sudden you go, hey, our hurdles to get to market and become a commercial product are a lot shorter, because it's a drug that's already approved. I mean, minoxidil was a blood pressure medication, and you can see by the beautiful head of hair that Mike Mataluni has that the minoxidil solves baldness. God, I can't even get him to smirk over there. He's really distracting. So
I gave you a wink. You didn't see my wink?
Oh, okay. Yeah, very good. So yeah,
Sorry,
that's something we hear about all the time. And it goes back to the point I made about psychedelics, I think, on some level, which is efficacy. A drug that does something, right? It has an effect. So we already know, like, for instance, you mentioned end-of-life anxiety, Michael, is a big problem that patients. And my mother was a critical care nurse for decades. And so she regularly dealt with patients that were at end of life. And one of the things they found in the hospital setting, and is still, there are clinical trials on it to this day that they're still trying, is they found that acetaminophen, basically Tylenol, this really simple pain reliever, has this dramatically positive effect on end-of-life anxiety. And it was just by accident, because you had people in the hospital, some were taking ibuprofen, some were taking aspirin, some were taking sodium naproxen or these other pain relievers. And the people that were on acetaminophen were suddenly just coming to a comfort with their end of their own life, coming to a comfort with that. And they said, could this just be that simple, that Tylenol is taking away the stress of fearing your own demise? And sure enough, there are clinical studies looking into that now, because efficacy. Tylenol does something. We know it does something. Let's find out all the cool things or bad things that it does and doesn't do.
Yeah, I have not heard that one before about the acetaminophen. That's definitely worth some further
anxiety.
reading.
Yeah, I learned that from my mother, but I've read studies about it in the last year or two. I'll forward you one.
I would appreciate that. That's awesome. And, you know, and especially when you talk about like the palliative of care and the end of life, right, that's going to be the theater, the venue that we see a lot of these psychedelics get approval for, especially for the testing. And anything
Especially
you
the
can do.
baby boomers are all geezers now. So we have this huge population of people who have crossed 70 or getting ready to cross 70 that are going to start dealing with the most dramatic, the final, they call it the third trimester in long-term healthcare, but that final third of life, the last, whether you live to 110 and it's your last 35, 36 years, or you live to 80 and it's your last 23 years, but that last third of life carries so much of those where biological health and psychological health meet each other. The old joke was if you hang out with old people, all they'll do is tell you about their ailments. But part of that is they're giving themselves therapy. We found that by talking about it makes it better. So when old people are getting together and going, oh, my knee this and my heart surgery, that and this and that, they're dealing with the stresses by talking it out and getting through it. So, and as an old guy myself, I can tell you that I'm looking forward to the opportunity to take psychedelic mushrooms in the hospital because it's good for me. So,
well, I mean, to your point, people turning 70 now, those are the same people that were in really people in their 70s, 80s, or I guess 70s and 80s now were the first Americans who are really taking LSD and psilocybin, back in the day. So I think we're seeing a resurgence in people's appetite for utilizing psychedelics for therapy, end-of-life therapy, depression. And I think a lot of that has to do with not only did, you go back and you look at Nixon and you look at the 70s and you look at what he did to shut down the use of psychedelics, not only as a recreational drug, but also in medical institutions. These drugs were being studied. I mean, they were being studied deeply back in the 60s, and all that shut down. And like you said earlier, Chris, I mean, we're just getting back into studying these things. And, I think part of, the reason we're seeing such an appetite for it now is people who are getting older and looking for alternative therapies. SSRIs aren't working, are people who, have an open mind to this sort of stuff. Whereas, people, 20 years ago in their 70s had no appetite for it.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the other things is not only did that funding get shut down and these got classified, but they got class 1. Most of them got class 1, and that means that they don't even have a medical application. I mean, cocaine has a medical application. It is still prescribed to people who have sinus issues, whereas you couldn't get psilocybin or LSD even if it was going to be life-saving.
Yep, and even still, it's very hard to study. It's still very hard to get approved. It's still very hard to study, especially in the States. That's why often you'll read these studies are like University of Queensland in Australia or the University of Denmark, or, you'll see a lot of these psilocybin studies and LSD studies and things are taking place in Europe or in Australia, places like that, because there's still that resistance. The other interesting thing, and this is without getting too far off on a tangent, if you look at the history of marijuana and you look at the history of medical marijuana, and what we're really seeing, and one of the biggest changes we're seeing is it's helping people get off opioids. It's helping people get off really strong. And I don't want to blame the pharmaceutical companies and get too conspiratorial, but along with banning them because they were connected to hippies and connected to this counterculture movement, I'm sure there was a strong fear in the pharmaceutical industry of something that has, again, high efficacy, something that does something. It's like, let's just shove this acid and this other stuff off to the side and not let anyone mess with it, or it might put us all out of business.
Well, not just the efficacy, but also the low addiction profile in comparison to an opiate.
Totally. As a matter of fact, again, I've written about that too. They have a hard time even finding anecdotal cases of addiction to LSD or mushrooms or whatever. And the same thing with marijuana and the painkillers. Now, marijuana is definitely addictive. I've had friends, and I've been close enough firsthand to see that. But the level of addiction is dramatically different.
Psychologically, right?
Yeah. So there's some more argument now about there might be a biological component because the way the brain chemistry acts, that if you are a regular user and you do use every day and you have multiple years in a row, there might become a point where, again, the neuroplasticity of your brain changes. That's the big thing with alcoholism, is there's a physical massive physical change to the brain. And so when you go off alcohol, you get those things. But marijuana, it's mostly psychological. With this really strong high THC levels we're dealing with now, with concentrates and things like that, I think that's what we're finding, is we're kind of into a new world where we're having to kind of relearn some of that. But generally, I think it was the comedian George Carlin who once said the reason he loved marijuana is it was the only drug that was a lot of fun but would let you leave it alone. And it was the idea that he said, I could be using it for a couple of weeks and then I could lose a joint in my house and I could find that same joint 6 months later and go, oh, this will be fun, as opposed to spending the next 3 days tearing apart your house looking for that joint you lost.
Right.
So, yeah.
But I have done that.
Psychedelics are way lower than that. Psychedelics have almost no physiological addiction component that's been identified or been studied in any reasonable way. Every once in a while, you will hear anecdotally somebody who's, oh, that guy's taken acid 1,000 times. Well, I'll tell you what, if you smoke pot 1,000 times and you're a pot smoker, that's like 2 years.
Yeah.
Right? That's not a lifetime of use.
If you take a hero's dose of psilocybin or you take LSD, I mean, the last thing you want to do the next day when you're sober is take LSD. This is not, you are not
exhausted.
So speaking of, so for those of you who don't know, psilocybin, it comes from mushrooms. You also wrote another story about lion's mane mushrooms. If you could bring that story up for us, Randy. It's called Lion's Mane Mushrooms Found to Magically Regrow Brain Cells. New research shows. It's really interesting how many uses. I mean, you think about how many things mushrooms can solve in this world. There's so many different types of mushrooms that have so many profound effects ecologically, psychologically, neurologically, for both humans and the planet. Can you tell us a little bit about what lion's mane is and why it's being found to regrow brain cells?
Sure. So there's a picture of it right there, I think, at the top of the article. But first of all, it just kind of looks like a lion's mane. It's got that kind of ropey, blonde, kind of dreadlock look of like a lion's mane mushroom. So here's what's great. Since I've done a lot of talking about efficacy and having a strong effect, there's this great history of herbal medicine, primarily coming from Asia. So, and literally going back thousands of years in places like China and India, where they have literally thousands of years of, again, not a lab setting, but anecdotal evidence, but a lot of trial and error.
Right.
And over time, a lot of drugs have come and gone from the classic Asian medicinal herbal treatments, but a lot of those have stuck around. And lion's mane is one of those that is ridden through the millennia, right? Is stuck around. It was being used over 2,000 years ago, was being used 1,000 years ago, and is still being used by traditional Asian medicinal practitioners in Malaysia and China now. And so they wanted to see, and what it's being used for, first of all, just general health. And there's a lot of herbal medicines that fall under that. They go, oh, it's just prescribed for general health. But they found for depression, for anxiety, and for PTSD. So again, the same kind of subculture of things that were showing benefit from psychedelic mushrooms were also being treated by a non-hallucinogenic, totally edible mushroom called lion's mane. So this is the one where they used the Petri dish that I was going to get to earlier.
Oh, right.
So this one, they actually took the active compound out of the mushroom, and I forget what it's called. It's got a long Latin name. And they took a Petri dish and they put nerve cells in it, and they shot the active compound in there, and more cells grew. The cells grew connections to each other. The actual cells that were there grew new cones, so the ability to grow new connections. So on every different level, whether it's new cells, new connections, or new cones, or buds, whatever the new offshoots where new connections would come from on the cell, it showed reactions in all of those ways. And this was huge because that's why they wanted to look at it. They said, God, there's so much anecdotal evidence of this thing really working, of really helping people with their memory, of really helping people with these anxiety and stress and depression conditions. We wonder if it's working the same way, that it's making new connections in the brain and it's helping reconnect those areas of the brain that had become muted either by experience, chemically, biologically, neuroplastically, whatever the situation was. And sure enough, when they shot it into the petri dish, it reacted in all the different ways you could think of, to new nerve growth, new buds, new cones they call them, and new dendrites, new actual connections where the cells started reaching out to each other right in the petri dish to make connections.
That's absolutely mind-boggling. Like the fact that they could do that out, because you think of these, whatever the compounds are that are actually causing the neural connections, you think about that in relation to ingesting it, that being absorbed into the bloodstream, the compounds intermingling in the brain, and then having reactions. But the idea that that's been accomplished in a petri dish that's astounding.
Yeah, like that's as raw as it gets, man.
Yeah.
That's hey, when you're taking this, like you said, your digestive system, your pulmonary, all the steps, all the cellular steps and chemical steps it takes for that to get to your brain and hopefully do something. Does any of that change the dynamic?
Right.
And when they went right to, let's shoot it right on the stinking brain cells, and it works right there directly. It's like about as provable as it gets.
Yeah, so many of these others require like a protein synthase within the brain to create something that's, a unique compound. And in this case, you're literally talking about building block to building block. You have a direct, this goes back to your use of the word efficacy, but that is pure efficacy right there.
Absolutely. And that's, again, like the reason they were so excited about it was this connection to traditional medicine, this idea that like, hey, we have this history, and traditional medicine has a lot of things like that, has a lot of things that are connected to appetite suppression, improved sleep, improved digestion, all these different areas. But this is one that in particular held this great promise because these mental health conditions are so pervasive and so treatment resistant. There was a big report about a year ago, and I hinted at it earlier, but there's a ton of new information and studies and meta-studies that all point to the fact that the vast majority of medications we're giving people for depression aren't working. And they're not, if you take an SSRI inhibitor, your serotonin levels are elevated within a day, but it may take you 6 weeks to experience the effects. There's no other medication we know of that works that way. There's nothing like you take this medication, the levels go up in your blood, but you don't get the biological benefits of that. So that was the first key, that maybe SSRIs weren't working the way we thought they were working. And again, pharmaceutical industry is not looking to turn off the faucet on a whole range of drugs that work on inhibiting the reuptake of serotonin. But there's a ton of body of evidence now that it doesn't work. It's not treating your depression. If anything, maybe it's got this weird side effect of like reducing the glutamate levels in your brain, and that glutamate is connected to depression. There's a whole other side science that people are looking into. It's like, well, maybe the SSRIs are accidentally helping your depression through this whole other mechanism. But what it's not doing is kicking your serotonin levels up by reducing the reuptake, and then all of a sudden you feel great. That's just not working.
We're talking a multi-billion-dollar industry. That's mind-boggling. But it's exciting. What we're seeing in psychedelics, what we're seeing in these sorts of studies is exciting, and I'm very excited to see what the future brings. I want to get to this last article here, which is
Mike, one quick thing before you transition, because I just had one more thing that I think is really fascinating about this. And Chris, you were bringing things up from Eastern medicine and homeopathy. And what I think so powerful about any of the stuff in the mycological field is this is super easy to grow. These are super easy to produce. We don't have a ton of resources required for it. You don't have to go kill rhinos to get a boner. I mean, we're talking about something that has a tremendous amount of efficacy without a tremendous amount of cost requirement. Or, you know, if we look further down the chain, it's not going to go require some giant industrial creation to make these drugs available to people.
And any new drug that hits the marketplace, any new medication, any new therapy, sometimes it takes decades to really see the negative side effects. You know, there's some new drugs that'll come on. It'll take 20 years before you go, you know what? Everybody who was taking that, you're now going to get liver cancer. We didn't know that 20 years ago. But where with things like lion's mane or these other homeopathic or traditional medicine approaches, they have centuries, if not millennia, of experience to show, no, this isn't toxic. This isn't going to do, because, you know, the medicine, number one rule, first do no harm. And that's the great thing about so much homeopathic medicine and why it holds such promises. The hard part has been done. We know what's safe and what's not safe. If you eat this oleander, you'll probably get a heart attack and die. But if you eat this wheat or whatever, like, it won't do anything to you health-wise. Maybe give you a little diabetes, right? So, yeah, that's what's amazing about the homeopathic medicine is the hardest part, the safety component, has been addressed. And like you said, it's just something you could grow. If it really proves viable, you know, Mike can go back there in his garden. He can pull up a couple of those weed plants. He's got too many, and he could grow some lion's mane mushroom back.
I'll make space in the garden. I wanted to hit on this final article. This is really interesting. It's called "Brain Changes in Fighter Pilots Caused by Extreme Forces Could Aid Future Space Travelers." And this is the reason I was kind of was like, oof, like this is a little bit scary, is because there are negative effects that pilots experience due to these extreme forces, but you've kind of outlaid this sort of positive outlook for space exploration. And, you know, are we talking about you know, changes to the brain that could, in specific fighter pilots, that they could then be ready for space? Or are we talking a greater adaptation that's happening here? Like, break that down for us.
Yeah, so Mike, it's actually some of both. So there are two main categories here. One is the reactions by the fighter pilot's brain, and by extension astronaut brains, to extreme G forces. So as we know, pilots experience extreme physiological forces, just flying around, making hard turns, flipping upside down. Astronauts experience this during the launch phase, extreme G forces. So those G forces have a physiological effect on their brain. So again, think about the neuroplasticity I was talking about and the way the brain reacts to physiological stimuli. So extreme G forces, extreme hard turns, the extreme forces the body goes through, the brain is reacting to that. And that's not as much a protective effect as a deleterious effect. It's just happening. It's like muscle atrophy from being in low gravity. So it's just not a good thing. There's no really at least in the studies I read about, there was no neuroprotective effect of that loss of connectivity and that loss of volume in the areas of the brain that deal with those G forces, and deal with the balance and the aspects of that. So they have this negative thing. Then they have this whole other flip side, which is information overload. So when you're a fighter pilot in particular, you have this heads-up display, you have your headphones, you have your instrument panel in front of you, and you're getting information of all types. You're getting warning lights, you're getting range indicators, you know, information. You're getting audio from your tower, you're getting audio from your Wizzo, you're getting all this information coming to you. And it really is information overload. It's something that pilots deal with all the time. So in the real world, if you're getting overload, say you're sitting in a room and the TV is blasting, you can't turn down the TV, your brain will turn it down. Your brain will start desensitizing itself to that extreme information, and it will mute it for you at least as much as it can. So that's what fighter pilots' brains are doing when they have this extreme information overload. What their brain is doing is dealing with it by desensitizing itself to it, so they can calm down. You know, athletes, they'll say when an athlete is a new football player, new basketball player, that they can't catch up to the speed of the game. Everything's going so fast. I hear this with basketball players all the time. Is everything's going so fast, I can't stay current. And the more they play, the more the game slows down for them. And that's their brain reacting physiologically to the extreme input of information. Astronauts, same thing. They're getting information overload, not just visual information, but sensor information, audio information, physiological information, feeling where you are, orientation, all of that. So that information overload, their brain kind of tunes it down and slows it down. They're not losing their ability to perceive all this data. They're increasing their ability to deal with this rapid, intense flow by cooling it down a little bit. So they found that both of these things happen with fighter pilots. They also happen with astronauts. And then the one other kind of really interesting thing in that article was with fighter pilots, there was a connection to amount of time and experience. So the more veteran the pilot, who had flown more missions, who experienced more G-forces, and who had experienced more information overload, they had a more extreme changes to their brain than a pilot who had only flown a few times. The more you experience it, the more of a lasting effect. And this goes across years. So we were talking about changes to the brain and temporary versus permanent. If you've got a pilot who's been flying for 20 years, they're going to have a physically dramatically different brain than a pilot who's been flying for a year or two.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, you almost this entire conversation through all of these articles and all the things we discussed, it really is interesting how each aspect of this conversation has come back to neuroplasticity. This idea that the brain is in a constant state of flux. It's constantly creating and discreating neural pathways to sensitize or desensitize to particular stimuli. And I mean, that to me, that's just fascinating because it really shows you how adaptable we are. I think it's easy to get kind of stuck in this idea of this is the way I am, this is how I am, you know, and I think people forget that by changing the environment or changing the stimuli that is either coming into your brain through your senses or simply the way that you think. And so I think somebody brought this up in the comments earlier, this idea of like, you really focus on the things that you're grateful for, you're happy about, or that make, you know, that give you joy. The more you focus on those things, the more you let that stimuli in, the more you can actively experience those emotions versus the opposite when you're constantly either bombarded by negative people, toxic mushrooms, you know, all of these different inputs that we're constantly putting into the brain. It's really interesting to kind of discuss the agency that we have over putting ourselves either ingesting, you know, physical things like a psychedelic, or you know, ingesting emotions, or experiencing massive G-force. All of these things in different ways have a relationship to how our brain functions, the neuroplasticity, and how we're constantly experiencing the world. It's truly fascinating.
Yep. And the reason in this particular study they were so interested in those sort of changes in fighter pilots was a really simple and practical one. We want to help people that are going to be future space travelers. We're expecting to have more and more astronauts, have more and more manned, you know, crewed missions going into space in the coming decades. But the number of people who have actually been to space is a very small number. So getting them to like all show up to the lab and let you do experiments on their brain to find treatments to help them with, hey, we don't want your brain shrinking because of the extreme G forces. What sort of treatments can we give you? And we don't want your brain to lose its ability to moderate highly intense stimulus. We don't want to maintain that plasticity. So when you're getting blasted with lots of information. But fighter pilots, at least as a subgroup, while still a small group of people relative to astronauts, you have thousands of people rather than dozens of people to choose from. So the idea was, in a lab setting, you know, they don't, if you want to study a black hole in the lab, you make an analog of a black hole. You don't build an actual black hole because it'll suck the whole lab in, right? So the idea of treating astronauts, what is an analog to an astronaut? And they found that fighter pilots were the closest thing, that they had these brain changes that were essentially identical to the brain changes we've witnessed in the small group of astronauts that have been studied. So all of a sudden, when we're looking to prepare future space travelers for the extreme Gs and for the information overload, and those are the brain things. I mean, we need to prepare astronauts for dealing with radiation, muscle atrophy, bone atrophy, circulation issues, all the things that go with zero G. But in these particular areas, the effects on the brain, we can actually work with fighter pilots to develop therapies so that when people go to space, their brains don't get screwed up.
Well, I think I need to stop doing so many roller coasters. That's probably a step in the right direction. Reduce the G-force on my own brain. I think the other thing
if you want to be an astronaut, if you got
you know, that was a childhood dream, but I don't meet their criteria anymore, nor will I ever again. I don't think. I think that's a young man's game now, right? Or you already are, right? They might send Buzz back up. But I think, Michael, you hit something that was really interesting, and you were talking about how the neuroplasticity is central to all of this. I think that one of the things that we talk a lot about in modern health is how having a sedentary lifestyle is so, you know, deleterious for us. And I mean, sitting is the new smoking, I've heard said. But, you know, one of the things I think that we need to be cognizant of is our mental input. If you're doing the same thing, thinking the same thing, surrounding yourself with an echo chamber every day, you're getting no new stimuli, and you're certainly not going out and experiencing new or different things, that's just as bad for your brain as sitting on the couch constantly is for your back in the long run.
I couldn't agree more.
Variety is the spice of life, Brooks.
I couldn't agree more there.
What's old is new again.
Yep. And it goes right with what we were saying about traditional medicine. Sometimes those old sayings are dead on because they're right, and it's true. And it is true that exactly that you use the sitting is the new smoking line, which was the line I was going to use, but it's true. Yeah. In these sort of studies, we're finding that the effects that you experience, the things that you experience, those affect your body and they affect your brain. And if they're having a bad effect and you're doing them over and over and over again, you're going to end up with some pretty poor health outcomes.
Yeah, we see this physically, right? If you don't lose it, if you don't use it, you lose it. I mean, you know, I just turned 44 and you can see all this, gray over here. And, you know, for some reason, Google knows that I'm interested in all these articles about old dudes and aging and how to slow down the process. But that's really that's the bottom line. You use it or you lose it. And the same can be said for your mental health, I believe.
We can do a whole show on age reduction, talk about mTOR inhibitors and rapamycin and mitochondria growth and all that fun stuff. That might be one for down the road.
Telomere length and calorie restriction. And there's a lot of science about aging.
Chris, you already know how...
no matter what you do, you're not going to make it past 150.
Chris, you already know how long my telomeres are.
Oh, you were so hot.
Are they as long as lobsters' telomeres?
I don't know. Is that do lobsters have extremely long telomeres?
Lobsters' telomeres actually never shrink as they age, and so lobsters are indefinitely immortal in the sense of dying due to longevity. In fact, they found lobsters that are I don't want to stretch this, but very, very old and will continue to grow to the point where they will end up dying because they can't consume enough calories to live, not because they die of aging.
Wow.
Yeah. They can only get so big too because of the squared cube law. So they will like literally their own weight will crush them at some point. So it's why you don't have gigantic lobsters or gigantic anything with a shell, gigantic snails or whatever. Is they'll just get to the point where their own mass will crush them.
Kaiju-sized lobsters running around, like attacking Japan and stuff.
Yeah, didn't they just Brooks? There was some clam in the news the other day that was like around since the time of Abraham Lincoln or whatever. Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, I also hear he was delicious.
Man, what this is, we definitely have to do a show on aging. Chris, my God, this has been one of the most fun shows we've had since we've been back. It's great to be with you. I really appreciate you being with us today. Can you share with folks if they want to learn more about you, if they want to read your articles, how do they do that?
Yes, I always tell people the easiest #1 way is just go to thedebrief.org. That's where I write. I put out anywhere from 3 to 4 stories a week covering all these cool, fun science things, whether it's cutting-edge military weaponry, advanced psychedelic studies, exotic propulsion, methods that are going to take us to the stars and beyond. I write about that sort of stuff every, 3 to 4 times a week over at thedebrief.org. And then under my name there is @plain_fiction. You can go on Twitter. I always keep my DMs open, and the wackier the better. So I'm not afraid of a wacky DM. If I don't reply, it does happen. But if you've got a exotic business concept or something crazy you heard of, hey, Chris, what's going on with these Chinese police stations in America, or something weird that you're like, what does that mean, or what is going on, and you want to shoot me a DM, if it's under the area of what we cover at the debrief, I'll look into it and report on it for you.
That's fantastic. Chris, I absolutely adore all the things that you write about are all the things that I'm passionate about and love to learn about. And you, my friend, are one of my favorite people. So thank you so much for joining us today. And we will catch you next time. If you haven't clicked the subscribe button, do so now. Click the like button. If you are just listening to us, make sure you go leave us a little review or share this podcast with a friend. We're on Apple Podcasts. We are on Spotify. And we appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to you very, very soon.
Thanks so much, Chris. Good to see you, buddy.
Thanks, Brooks. Good to see you, my man. Awesome.
Well done, Randy. Well done.
My wife will ask me, why is it you love Mataluni again? And now I can tell it.
I didn't do that. That's our AI Randy from behind the scenes.
Oh, good job, Randy.
Randy is on top of it.
Timing, my friend. That's putting in the good work.
Bye, guys.
All right. Well, hey, thanks for having me on, Mike. That was fun. I love you, man. Anytime you need me, I am here.
Oh, that's amazing because we